Hello, colleagues. How are you doing? This is the second episode of the Read, Write, Mike podcast, specifically devoted to information around the vocabulary curriculum. In our first episode, we talked a little bit about the activity that you would do on a day one, which is introducing the words to students and inviting them to think about how well they think they know the word. But what I want to do today is I want to actually back up to information that occurs before day one. And I want to take a look at the schedule, the recommended scope and sequence for the vocabulary curriculum, because as you know, or will know soon, that the words are drawn from read alouds that go with the reading units of study. And so using words from the books that you're reading aloud, it is recommended by vocabulary experts such as Beck, McKeon, and Kukin to introduce a word meaning after it's already occurred in a book that you've read. And so I just want to show you that schedule, that scope and sequence, and show how it's a little bit in tension with the read aloud schedule, scope, and sequence that's in your reading units of study. And what can you do to navigate this? Because one of the scopes and sequences for vocabularies is focused on vocabulary. And the scope and sequence for the read aloud plans for the reading units of study is focused on the reading unit of study. And so I think there's a way to do it, to finesse it. And I want to show you some things to think about, whether you choose to follow more of the vocabulary schedule or the reading units of study schedule, because they won't line up one-to-one, right? Okay. If you take a look at, for example, the overview of the suggested read aloud schedule for vocabulary, you'll notice that in the middle column, it'll say when to read particular chapters. You'll see when they might align with particular reading units of study sessions, and then what to do on a vocabulary day. And the way this is designed is that to make sure that you have read the requisite chapters and pages so that you've already gone over the word before you introduce it. So for instance, on a day one, you'll have read chapters 1 and 2, and then you'll want to introduce the words and then teach the word wealth. Now, having read chapters 1 and 2, you'll already have gone over the word wealth by then. And so when you introduce it to students, they'll be familiar with it. They'll have already taken it in, and you could reference it back in the text. And the reason this is important is that reference back to the text is sort of the mnemonic device that's going to help kids remember the word better, to have it situated in a story, in a real context. So wealth isn't just this word in the air. And so in this middle column, reading these chapters, and I try to keep it to like 2 chapters a day initially, will make sure that you get to all of the recommended words. Now, if you take a look at, say, the reading units of study sessions, recommended schedule for read alouds, it's a little bit different. You'll see something that doesn't exactly align one-to-one with the vocabulary schedule. So for example, you'll see in the vocabulary, it says, get started right away reading the first couple chapters, but in the reading units study schedule, it won't say that until, you won't even get started until session 3. And so that's something to keep aware of. Now, for some of us, that it might make us feel a little bit anxious to follow the vocabulary schedule over the reading units of study schedule, and I get that. I think if you're a little bit more knowledgeable of reading units of study, you'll feel better about that. You'll feel better about, I can prioritize the reading vocabulary schedule and not the units of study schedule. But if you're newer to units of study, perhaps you do follow the reading units of study schedule. So there's a way around this. There's something that you can do that can help this out. And here's what I would recommend. So let's say, for instance, you're following the reading units of study schedule, and suddenly, you have to teach the words frantic and tradition, but you haven't gotten to those pages where those words have appeared in the book, in this case, The Year of the Dog. So a couple of things that you can do, right? You could teach the word as situated in perhaps another book that you've read, or you could situate the word in a classroom context. Instead of saying, in the book Year of the Dog, we see that so and so is frantic. You could say, in our classroom, you saw me frantically looking for my attendance sheet this morning, right? Frantic means, then give that definition. So that would be a real context for kids to see it. You could also teach the word in the context of the book where it maybe has appeared but hasn't explicitly appeared. So maybe a character has been frantic and the word frantic hasn't appeared. So you could say, I want us to pay attention to this word frantic because so far in the Year of the Dog, so and so has been frantic. And in a few pages and a few chapters, we're going to see them being frantic again. We're actually going to see the word frantic. So I want you to keep an eye out for it, right? So you can give a preview to it. And then when you get to the word, you would want to highlight it again. Now you can introduce words before, during, or after reading. It's just that the recommendation is that we introduce the words after the reading. So it's situated within a context. So that's why the schedule is a little bit different for vocabulary, because it is designed to make sure that the word has an actual context in which kids can learn it. It's not just a word in the air. But what do we say? What are some ways that we can get around it? We can, one, situate it in a context in our own classroom. Like, how does this word appear in our classroom? Two, you could situate the word in the context where the concept of the word appears in the book, but the word itself doesn't appear yet. That often can happen. Or it could be in a book that you've read a different book. You could situate it in the context of the different book. Remember, the word doesn't actually have to appear in the book in order for you to teach it. I just tend to pick words that do appear in books. So if something is frantic in a book, but the word's not frantic, you can still teach the idea of the word frantic. And then when you get to the page in the Year of the Dog, for instance, where you're reading the word frantic, then you'd want to make sure that you reintroduce it and you cover it with kids. So to sum up, whether you follow the read aloud schedule for the vocabulary curriculum or whether you follow the read aloud schedule for the reading units of study, this can be done. You can also let's think of it this way. If you were to follow the vocabulary unit of study, that provides some other issues as well, right? So in your reading unit of study, so sometimes like you'll be asked to read a passage, and in the read aloud for the unit of study book, and perhaps you haven't read it or you've already read it and you needed to read a particular passage. The same concept appears. So let's say you're teaching an envisioning lesson and you haven't, because you follow the vocabulary schedule, you haven't gotten to that portion where you're teaching envisioning. So go to a different part of the book that you have read that has good envisioning and use that as your passage for the mini lesson. It's the same concept, that you go to whatever portion of the book that you've read that can support whatever it is that you're teaching. And so in the case of vocabulary, if the book doesn't yet support it, find a way for it to exist in like the classroom, the real world, or another book that you've read. So I hope that clears up some of the confusion for some people who are initially starting the reading units of study. They'll notice the two schedules and say, wait a minute, they'll get a little anxious. Like, which one am I supposed to follow? I say, pick one and then make a decision about, how you're going to navigate the teaching of the reading skill or the vocabulary word in the other curriculum. It's totally can be done. We can reach out to some pilot teachers to see what they've said about it to sort of mitigate it. But I think, probably your first go around in the unit, you'll sort of like figure it out for yourself. By unit 2, you'll be like, okay, I've got a good strategy for how this works. So I hope this was helpful information, and I can't wait to talk with you more about it. I think for our episode 3, the thing that we'll do together is we will dive into those example, not examples, and talk a little bit more about when you're introducing words, what are the steps, why, and talk a little bit about example, not example, and how that is a helpful way for students to get started holding on to that word. So we can store that word in long-term memory so they can transfer it to their talk and to their writing. Hope you enjoyed this episode, and I will see you next week for another episode in the Read Write Mike podcast for the vocabulary curriculum. Take care, colleagues.